The success of Pokemon Legends ZA indicates that the Nintendo Switch 2 is not only a huge success, but it will continue to coexist with Nintendo Switch 1. This game is a bestseller on both Switch 2 and Switch 1, and a lot of people don't understand what this means. Is that although a lot of people have upgraded to a Switch 2, the Switch 1 platform is still very much viable and will continue to be supported for years to come, which means that the video game console that outsold the PS2, the most successful video game console in history, the Nintendo Switch, will continue to be sold on store shelves, continue to get new releases, and continue to be relevant as the Nintendo Switch 2 continues to succeed in its own way. So essentially, Nintendo has found a way to allow these platforms to coexist, which means that there won't be a massive drop off of the user base, like with each console generation, and suddenly the massive giant gigacope that has surrounded a lot of enthusiast circles. The idea that there would be this huge drop off after the Switch One generation is simply never going to happen. This is the end of Nintendo hate. This means essentially that it will be impossible for PlayStation and Xbox to just steal Nintendo's user base and render them obsolete because plenty of people still have viable Nintendo consoles still lying around. So even if someone spends like 3 or 4 years, not playing Nintendo, not engaging with the software, not engaging with the hardware, like they can just jump right back in at any time. Like that's the reality of this situation is that it's going to be exceedingly difficult gaslighting people into thinking that older software was better, that Nintendo used to be good, that old games were way better than what's coming out now when all of those old games are readily available on the new platforms. Like again, this is a massive issue that a lot of Nintendo haters can't wrap their minds around is that because the Switch 1 library, all of those older releases, the NSO games, the eShop games, like because all of them are readily available on Switch 2, Switch 2 simply never had a drought period and never will. Like the entire cope that people had that like Switch 2 has no games. It completely relied on this idea that new third parties would not come out, that old games would not be available, and that uh, all of this would be a like the major first party Nintendo games would just be failures, all of that was built off of like the classic, Nintendo problem of not being able to have every single one of their consoles be backwards compatible. But with Switch 2, it's no longer an issue. They can release a console with Mario Kart World, and then just be like, okay, we also have a Fighter port, we have Hitman, we have like Yakuza, and a lot of people like seethed about it, like, oh no, these are old games. I don't care about old games, but Mario Kart is a new game, and nobody on the planet has played every single launch game that came out on Switch 2. Like to this day, I still haven't played Rune Factory Guardians of Azuma much, and Rune Factory 4 was one of my favorite games of all time. So with that being said, with that being said, it feels as if the initial cope around Switch 2, like the idea that it has no games, that it's not going to drive in customers, that it's not selling, like all of that, we're at the point now, as of Legend ZA's release, that this is very observably not true. Even if you do buy a Switch 1 version of the game, a quick $10 update patch will get you the upgraded version of it, the Switch 2 version. Like ports of games that released on Switch 1 are getting upgraded versions on the Switch 2. Games like Yakuza Kiwami. Uh, we are seeing more and more people like start to discover like more niche Nintendo properties. So you can no longer simply cry that Nintendo only has Mario, Zelda, and Pokemon. All of the classic copes, like downplaying major Nintendo games over the decades have just kind of collapsed. Even the age old thing of like, oh well, this random third party game is better than anything Nintendo does. Like, that's not going to work when that random third party game is getting a release on Nintendo hardware. Elden Ring is a really interesting case study where this was the most overhyped game of the decade. The game that everyone cried and said was better than like anything Nintendo has ever done. Not only is it getting a Nintendo port, Nintendo has contracted the team to produce a Nintendo Switch 2 exclusive. So there's simply nothing that the community can do to like continue this farce that Nintendo is failing. If Elden Ring's out on Switch 2, if it's the best version of the game, if it's getting like an exclusive new title from the developers on that console, which is exclusive, by the way. The idea that Duskbloods is going to go multi-plat eventually is just a cope. Like, if you look into like all of this, like you kind of realize that there's no real reason to engage with PC, Xbox, or PlayStation. Xbox is like straight up not even being sold on store shelves right now. Like PlayStation is irrelevant and PC was has been dead since the 2000s. Like Nintendo has essentially won the console war. And we're still in this like weird phase where a lot of people in their 30s, 40s, boomers are still kind of like spurging out about it. It is their central identity, like their center of being to hate Nintendo, to religiously hate everything they do. And it's just something that won't survive, I think, the next decade. Like it's something, well, actually I think it's dead now, but the culture that continues to try and like keep this alive is just going to slowly wither away over the next 10, 20, 50 years. I remember being told, just how irrelevant Nintendo was and how they would go out of business and how they would go third party and how Xbox would survive because Microsoft was such a big successful company, and it didn't work. And now like you have people like going out there and saying that like, well, Disney's going to stop Nintendo somehow. And Disney is not as big as Microsoft. They are not invested in gaming. They are not relevant in any way, shape, or form. And yet people are mourning the loss of Microsoft. People are saying that losing Xbox is a major loss for gaming, even though this is the company that normalized paid online play and horse armor DLC. Xbox has been a blight on gaming, and yet traditionally people have seen Nintendo as being the problem. Nintendo as being this limited, boring company made for little children, for toddlers. And now, you even have people like Synthetic Man seeing that the target audience for this stuff are fetuses. It's like, how out of pocket can you get with these takes? Like, how delusional can you be with your coping and seething about how there's literally no audience for Nintendo products? Like, I don't understand, like, how what this is going to result in. I don't understand why people are still coping and seething about the success of Nintendo consoles. Like, a lot of people are genuinely upset about the success of Pokemon Legends EA, and I think that feeling is going to extend to Hyrule Warriors Age of Imprisonment, Kirby Air Riders, Metroid Prime 4. Three high profile games that are coming out in the next month or so. Like, the narrative that Switch 2 has no games was dead before it even took off. Okay, it's like when you crack an egg and like it's just a yolk. You're right. It never developed. It never formulated into a proper bird or like other animal. Like, it's just yolk, because it never developed. It was never a thing. It was never going to be alive, like the cope was there, it formulated, they went through the process, they tried creating a conspiracy, and it just completely imploded, it just completely cracked. And I'm very, very curious as to how long that like they can possibly continue this, because you already have people like that Frogmire guy. He's trying to cover Pokemon Legends ZA. He's trying to say it's bad, and like I'm told that like he's trying to emulate the Nintendo Switch 1 version, which is why it doesn't look very good, which is why it's glitchy, which is why it has all these problems, Like the obvious problem with this is the fact that he's emulating the game, And I think we saw this with Scarlet and Violet too, where like all the weird glitches we saw early on were just from people emulating and not playing on actual hardware. Again, this is a real problem in this community now, where people think they can get away with this stuff and like pass it off as genuine, and it's just not going to survive. I think the emulation thing has kind of reached its apex. The piracy thing, the coping about Nintendo. Like there's just no real justification for this narrative that Nintendo is the most evil company in gaming, and that's something like when you talk to people about Nintendo and they throw that at you, it just comes off like a cope, like they're justifying their own prejudices and biases against Nintendo, when in reality there's nothing to really indicate that. Like, what is Nintendo doing that's so much worse than Microsoft and Sony? And the answer is nothing, as I've expanded on over and over again on this channel. But the narrative has always been that Nintendo is the worst company there is. They are the most evil corporation in gaming, and it's nothing but a big cope, and it does need to be called out for what it is. Like Pokemon Legends ZA is incredibly successful, and yet the community is just doing everything it possibly can to downplay it. It is time that we as Pokemon fans speak out against this nonsense.